Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and evening and night, wherever the time zone may be. My name is Nir Isakovich, and I run the Applied Ethics Center at UMass in Boston. Delighted to have this second forum on digital futures. This is the Boston-Bergen Forum, a collaboration between Media Futures Center in Bergen, the Applied Ethics Center in UMass Boston, and also co-sponsored by the MIT Center for International Studies and the Human Rights and Technology program there. Briefly, a few years ago, we started a program on artificial intelligence and experience, which was meant to promote research and public conversations on how living with AI changes people's everyday personal and political experiences. I met Chris, learned about his interest in technology and protests, so this was a natural kind of event series to organize. So I will, Chris, pass this on to you and have you continue with the introductions. Thank you again, and welcome everybody.
Great. Thanks much, Neil, and welcome all of you. My name is Chris Senf. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Bergen in Norway. And as Neil just mentioned, I'm currently a Fulbright Fellow at UMass Boston. Together with Anna Milojevic, I'm moderating this panel event today. And I'm very excited that our event, AI and the Future of Protest Discourse, is actually happening. As Neil just mentioned, this event is part of an international collaboration between UMass Boston's Applied Ethics Center, Media Futures Bergen, and the MIT program Human Rights and Technology, which is co-directed by John Tierman and Anat Beletsky. And on behalf of John and Anat, I am to give you a warm welcome as well from MIT. Also, we have a short greeting note from our co-organizer and friend, Christoph Tröttner from Media Futures in Norway. Christoph.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christoph. I'm super happy to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Christoph Tröttner. I'm a center director of Media Futures here at the University of Bergen, which is a new research center on responsible media technology and innovation. From my side, also a very warm welcome to all of you, and great to see that so many of you are joining this second panel event today on AI and the future of protest discourse. Yeah, as you know, AI technology has shown to be of great value in various application domains, yet it also has raised significant ethical problems, as we know, such as the creation of echo chambers in online media systems and the amplification of polarization in public debates. So we've heard a lot about that. And the main objective of our center is to develop more responsible media technology, for example, AI-based recommender systems that help to mitigate those harmful societal effects and engage the media users in a healthier and less biased and alternatively more democratic way, as we say that. Yeah? Well, however, these challenges not only create a need for improved mechanisms for media recommenders, but also bear the question of how citizens should use media technology more responsible, particularly while engaging in politics and protests, as we know. Yeah? So this interplay, as we call it, between AI-based media technology and political engagement is what we wish to address in the panel today. And I am super glad that this event is actually happening, and hope this international collaboration between UMass Boston's Applied Center, Ethics Center, hopefully that was the right pronunciation, and Media Futures Bergen is the only just the start for future events. And yeah, I really wish us all a very nice panel today, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Before we start with the talks and following up on Christoph's words, I wish to briefly outline the topic of our panel today. So over the past decades, we have witnessed astonishing protest events with activists using social media platforms to mobilize masses and bring about change. For instance, Occupy's Facebook movement or Me Too's #activism shifted the public's attention to urgent issues, politicized everyday life, and supercharged democratic participation. However, there's increasing debate, and Christoph just mentioned that, about the flip sides of these forms of collective action. An ever-growing datafication, meaning tracking, monitoring, predicting, and modeling of our media behavior for profit purpose, raises the serious question of how new media technology is not just enabling, but challenging and restricting movement protests. For instance, how should we evaluate a movement's goal and individuals' participation when the business model driving their means of communication aims at driving up engagement and grow network interaction? How should we evaluate political engagement on platforms like Twitter or Facebook, shaped by AI-driven misinformation or esteemed feedback loops and the fear of missing out? And our panel today picks up these pressing conceptual and normative issues by bringing together a media scientist, an economist, and a philosopher debating the challenges of political activism in the age of AI and platform capitalism. And my colleague, Anna Milojevic, will now introduce our great three panelists.
Thank you, Christoph. Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Milojevic, and I'm a Marie Curie scholar and postdoctoral researcher at the Media Futures Research Center. And I'm excited to take part in the Boston-Bergen Forum on Digital Futures as a moderator. At this event, we have three distinguished speakers, as already Chris mentioned. First, Stefania Milan. She is Associate Professor of New Media and Digital Culture at the University of Amsterdam and Faculty Associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And she will talk about the citizen agency in the age of AI. Second, we have Robin Schelicatis, Professor of Social Philosophy at Freie Universität in Berlin and Deputy Director of the Center for Humanities and Social Change at the Humboldt University, Berlin. And he will address the question, can the digital disobedience be civil? Finally, we have Will Davis, Professor of Political Economy at Goldsmith University in London and co-director of the Political Economy Research Center. He will talk about In Search of Proportionality, Nonsense, and Meaning in the Digital Public Sphere. So I would like to give the floor to our speakers now and kindly ask Stefania Milan to begin our panel debate.
Thank you very much, Anna, Christoph, and all the organizers.
So, kann ich leider nicht mehr so sozial sein, weil ich muss hier eine...
Everybody just mute themselves, please.
I hear some German voice at the background. But whenever I don't hear it anymore, can I go now? Okay, awesome. So thank you very much, everyone, for having me here today, and Anna for the kind introduction. My name is Stefania Milan, and I work out of the Media Studies Department at the University of Amsterdam. As Anna mentioned, I'm also affiliated with your neighbors, Harvard University, except that I haven't had the chance over the last year and a half since my affiliation started to ever visit. So let's hope that one day I can combine both visits, visiting MIT and Harvard together. I'm really looking forward to that. But not everything is bad in COVID times, in the sense that even if I'm actually currently a bit sick and I will not be able to travel, I'm able nonetheless to be with you today. And so I look at the positive side. However, also have to apologize in advance for being a bit low energy, which is due to some antihistamines that I'm taking these days, which make me a bit drowsy and sleepy. So sorry about that, but I still try to share what I have to share with you today. And I would like to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation for you that I've prepared for you. I hope you can see it. Can you just make like some, okay, awesome, thumbs up sign, fantastic. So thank you very much again. And what I would like to discuss with you today is not much actually the protest discourse in itself, but the context in which the protest discourse and social movements happen today. In what I have entitled Citizen Agency in the Age of AI, it's a bit of a, a broad topic, so don't expect anything exhaustive or conclusive, but just some thoughts as I approach this topic, on which I've been working for the past year and a half. And my perspective is that of a media scholar, but also of a digital sociology, therefore the agency in the title, interested in grassroots forms of organizing, but also with a focus on how people engage specifically with technology. So social movements broadly conceived, yes, but specifically, how do people make sense of and come to terms with a growing complex technological environment, of which AI technology is merely a component, and definitely a component that is becoming more and more prominent these days. So back in 2017, you might remember this title. The Scientific American magazine published an opinion piece entitled, "Will Democracy Survive Big Data and Artificial Intelligence?" And the caption reads, "We are in the middle of a technological upheaval that will transform the way society is organized. We must make the right decisions now." And if now really held true for 2017, it's even more true for 2021, when the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has accelerated technological developments in a way that is positive in many aspects, but also scares us, especially if we are worried about, for example, privacy and data protection rights and other related digital rights. So I also have to say that not much, I think, has changed in terms of the way civil society, the organized civil society, deals with this. Although what I'm saying is probably unfair in the sense that more and more we see non-governmental organizations, some of which are also quite big, that are acting explicitly on AI technology and are trying to increase the literacy amongst the laymen and the laywomen about this complex set of technologies. This was, talking about a changing context in which social movements and political discourse unfolds today. This is a piece that appeared on The Guardian in the United Kingdom back in January 2020. Was right before the pandemic became a reality also in the Western world. And it reported the fact that the London Metropolitan Police, the so-called Met Police, was to begin using live facial recognition cameras in London. Now, I guess most of you have visited London at one time in your life, and you certainly have noticed that even without facial recognition cameras, surveillance, security cameras, the so-called CCTV cameras, closed-circuit television cameras, were and are a big reality in London and throughout the United Kingdom more in general. However, what the newspaper pointed to is that all of a sudden, and without really interrogating or asking Londoners or the parliament or any other form of local administration, the police forces in London decided to change or to implement, let's say, extra software in their cameras by adding these facial recognition facilities. Now, facial recognition is based on probability. So it takes a picture, actually not really a picture, but let's imagine a picture of our face. It's not really the picture as we will see it, but it analyzes the distances between certain parts of the human face, like between the tip of my nose and between the corner of my eye, and so on and so forth. And based on these, profiles of individual citizens are created, which are matched in real time with existing police data set, law enforcement data sets. Now, the problem is that although the Metropolitan Police said that the system, as you can see there in the slide, was 70% effective at spotting wanted suspect and falsely identified someone, as wanted in 1 out of 8,000 cases, an independent review of the technology by Access University found that actually the accuracy rate was merely 19%, meaning literally out of 100 people identified as potential suspects or culprits or criminals, only 19 were in fact criminals, and the rest were false positives, with all the consequence of that this might, of course, bring along. Now, this was pre-pandemic. Now, what we have seen is an immense acceleration of facial recognition technology in the pandemic times. For example, the football stadium of the Rome football club in Italy implemented facial recognition cameras throughout the stadium. And I can tell you, I'm an Italian national, so I followed the debate. Well, there was actually no debate whatsoever. It was simply presented to the citizenry, hey, look, we are so advanced, we allow you to resume going to the stadium, even in COVID times. This is, of course, designed to, track down people with fever, but of course it has much more consequences. And this was, adopted with no prior discussion. At least in London, what happened was that, for example, Amnesty International, a lot of other non-governmental organizations made their voice heard and protested the situation. Back to the UK, it's the news of October 2021. So yesterday, literally, that some UK schools are using facial recognition to to allow the pupils to pay for their lunch in schools. Again, what you see is what, as the subtitle there puts it nicely, the slow normalization of facial recognition. Now, facial recognition is just one of the many biometric technologies that implements artificial intelligence, but one of the most invasive. It's like literally walking with our open passport plastered here in our forehead. And this might be troubling for many of us. Now, when we think about artificial intelligence, however, I cluster in this broad spectrum of technology. Also, technology was actually not very artificial intelligence oriented or based. Like, for example, I don't know how much our US colleagues are familiar with that, but the so-called EU Green Certificate or Digital COVID Certificate, which I include simply because it allows me to point to the fact that a lot of this technology is used for governance purposes. So it's used to police the urban space, but it's also used to determine who is part of a polity and what is not part of a given community, who is allowed access in certain areas and who is not allowed access. With good reason sometimes. Maybe, we are in times of a pandemic and we might actually welcome some of this technology because it facilitates our life and allows us to resume some of our activities and our freedom of movement. But it's also a fact that COVID has contributed to lower our awareness and our fears when it comes to privacy and spearheading really broad technological adoption with very little questions. What for me is also very scary with all of this technology, besides this, the governance consequences of it, is also the fact that, as my colleague Silvia Masiero from Oslo University wrote in a blog post, this has very concrete, sometimes inequality consequences. In India, for example, where there is the biggest biometric digital identity system implemented, you might choose to opt out, but you might not be able to opt out if you want to access, for example, a food subsidy program, which is one of the poverty reduction programs of the government, for which you have to add in your fingerprint. Unfortunately, during COVID, this program was halted, so poor people, poor families could not have access to food subsidies that is crucial to their survival, especially in a time where even the informal economy is completely stopped, right, in a pandemic time, precisely because of the biometric functionality. So in a moment in which at the beginning of the pandemic, it was absolutely unclear how the virus would spread, the government and local administration decided to stop the program altogether. Now, this is a bit paradoxical, it's a bit of an extreme, but it points to, the forms of exclusions on the one hand and the forms of privilege on the other hand. Exclusion because, sometimes technology might not work even in time of a pandemic, and forms of privilege because not everyone has the ability to opt out when actually we can opt out. Because for the most part, if you're walking down the street in London or elsewhere, also in the Netherlands, we have some similar programs of facial recognition technology in the urban space, we might simply not even be aware of it. So you really do not opt out because you're simply not conscious that things exist. So this is more or less the context under which social movements have to mobilize today, whether they decide to deal with or address the issue of technology and the technological environment or not. So this brings me to the question, as AI technology, of which, as I said, biometric technology is one, probably the most prominent today, accelerated the crisis of liberal democracy. And the answer, in a way, for me, is yes, in the same way in which, a process known as datification, so the transformation of pretty much any social interaction, but also personal preferences and taste and actions online and offline into data known as stratification, has contributed to break the social contract between the state and its citizens. In what ways? Well, this is, of course, a very broad question, and I'm not going to solve it all for you today, but I want to focus on the fact that one aspect of it, and the fact that when we are dealing with human-machine interactions, which are biased, in favor of machine decision-making, this can put citizen sovereignty at risk. And it's not only the case of, when technology is implemented, like what I mentioned about London, without asking citizens to, for example, vote, or parliament to decide whether it's constitutional even to have this form of technology in the urban space, such an invasive form of technology. But I'm also referring to the fact that for the most part, citizens are unaware of the functioning of artificial intelligence technology, which appears and is often presented deliberately as sort of beautiful magic that is designed to make our life simply much easier. And by citizen sovereignty, I refer to, of course, citizen agency, but also the ability of citizens to make informed choices in a democracy. So not only people not asked, but they also often don't have the tools to make decisions in the case they are asked. But this should nonetheless not be a reason not to ask citizens how they feel about things. Now, by the way, I just realized I have no way of seeing the time, and I don't have any watch under my eyes. So I will ask maybe the moderator to make some signs at some point if I'm going overboard. Simply because I don't even have my phone nearby and I have no sense of time. Okay, so quickly moving on, what is agency and where can we find it and how can we foster it? A citizen agency in the age of AI. Well, I adopt, as I mentioned, I have a background in sociology and political sociology, to be more precise. And like all sociologists, I really, work with this kind of mental distinction between agency, which is what citizens do or can do or want to do, and structure, which is actually what envelops us, which refers to social norms, institutions, but also, of course, any constraints and possibilities and opportunities of the environment where, in this case, social movements or citizens move. And I also want to underline the fact that agency is a process, is never just a given. I want to refer to the work by our colleague, media scholar Nick Coldry, that wrote on agency as the process of making sense of the world so as to act within it. So it's a mix between awareness and the ability and the willingness to act. And also refer back to a piece that is a very dense theoretical piece, but if you really want to look at agency in a theoretical manner, I think it's one of the best pieces. It's by Emin and Misha, 1988, in the American Journal of Sociology, that asks, what is agency? And what they tell us is that agency is intentional, is reflexive, is informed, is relational, and it is situated. And the fact that it is relational and situated is particularly important for us if we care about political discourse, because it really points to the fact that it's never just the action of one single individual, by what we individuals create and think and make sense of in relation to others. But also I want to point out to the fact that agency is intentional. It's not, the action of opening the fridge or taking the bus is not necessarily what defines citizen agency. So it's a bit, it's one step forward, and it's also informed and possibly critical. And so where can we find agency in human-machine interactions today? And how is agency, in a way, sort of getting a bit lost or a bit, suffering in this equation of the human, or in this tension between the human and the machine? Well, AI technologies often roll out, as the case of London shows, in the absence of public debate, in the absence of democratic oversight, but also outside a system of adequate regulation. Which is the reason why, for example, there are some big technological company like IBM that not long ago actually decided to stop producing biometric, so basically facial recognition software, precisely because there is no adequate legal safeguard for the moment. Yet we see at the same time that there's many other companies that are actually doing it, and many public administrations who enthusiastically buy and spend money and adopt certain technology. And then what I mentioned also in relation to the pandemic is that once adopted in time of crisis, and the pandemic, of course, qualifies pretty much as times of crisis, the presence of this technology is rarely ever questioned. Technology are typically not taken back. They're already there. We spend so much money for it. They work, they help us. Why should we even bother, right? So, but where, to answer my question, where can we find this tension? I mean, this human-machine interaction, this tension, the agency? Well, I like to locate it in the bottom-up practices of engagement with AI technology and the creation of counter-imaginaries. So the efforts that social movements are increasingly doing with the help of certain thematic digital rights non-governmental organizations in the creation of alternative way of thinking about this technology to create awareness among the citizenry, but also to enable the citizenry to say yes or no to technology, and empower the citizenry to demand, for example, increased public participation in these very important decisions. And I have some examples. Allow me to bring.
You have a few more minutes left.
Yeah, okay, I'm actually getting to the end, so we're good. Thank you very much, Christopher. So I have a couple of examples for you. This is a campaign that probably exists in similar fashion also in the United States. I'm not aware of that, or in Canada, but this is a European campaign called Reclaim Your Face. It's a big campaign that tries to gather 1 million signatures by February 2022. So the clock is ticking. And in order to ask, so once you have 1 million signatures from 7 member states of the European Union, you can ask for basically a referendum. So you can ask for legislation. So you can propose legislation as a citizenry. And the idea here is that biometric surveillance objectifies, commodifies, and dehumanizes people. So we have to ban facial recognition technology from public space. This is a very important campaign because it's the first one that really on the large scale tries to draw attention to the problem, but also stimulates a collective response. But there's also other attempts at making sense of artificial intelligence, in particular facial recognition technology by citizenry. So this is called computer vision Dazzle. So CV Dazzle is known as, it's an artistic project. And the attempt here is to encourage citizens to cover their face with pretty invasive and colorful makeup to hide literally, so to basically mess up with the software that is supposed to recognize your face as you walk down the street. Now, as it happens, it seems that the amount of very colorful camouflage is pretty much. What works best is actually this, is covering your face with your hair, which might, however, not work for everyone, for example. Now, this is an artistic project, activist artistic project. So it's not something that is really, trying to get people to do it in a way, but the attempt here is to create this counter imaginary. So to encourage people to deal with this technology instead of shying away from it, and get to think about it and get to think proactively about potential solutions, but also about how intrusive they might be. And finally, another very important aspect, this deals with a grant that I had, the project called Algorithm Exposed, but where we try to come to terms with the shaping power, the power to shape the political discourse, the protest discourse that social media and personalization algorithms in particular have. And here we did try with social movements to develop tools to help citizens and social media users to understand how tracking and profiling works. And maybe I can tell you more about that in the question and answer if you are curious. And this is the article where you find a lot of these references. But to conclude, what about the future of the protest discourse? So some food for thought. As such, excuse me, I haven't spoken much about protest discourse per se, but I've spoken to the context in which the protest discourse unfolds. And you might remember, and I have no picture about that in this presentation, for some reason they slipped out, but you might remember a couple of years ago in Hong Kong, protesters taking down, so pro-democracy protesters taking down lampposts that were believed to implement facial recognition technology. So this is exactly the context that I'm talking about. So a context which is more and more invasive, and especially when people can and want to take the streets, they are increasingly surveilled, and the urban space is not exactly as conducive as it was to, protest, for example. So just some food for thought of some work in progress. Well, 3 points to conclude. Social movements should become more and more aware of the shaping power of technological infrastructure. Christoph mentioned it earlier as well, right? Personalization algorithms and the filter bubble. I didn't speak much to this aspect that was quite prominent in my work, but indeed social movements are supposed to become, to understand that they're not as free to articulate their discourse as they might have been in the past. Second, the importance of developing a critical discourse on technology, as the examples, the Reclaim the Face campaign or the CV Dazzle example point to. Even if movements don't necessarily mobilize on technology per se, they are no longer in the luxurious position of ignoring the technological environment in which they mobilize. And third, it's important to create more and more awareness about technology. And while there might be a division of labor whereby some big thematic NGOs might do the job of creating these counter images that I was talking about, this should also be dealt with seriously and with decision by social movements and mobilized maybe on completely different topic and set of issues. And I leave you with this, and thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't go too much overboard with time. Thank you. I stopped sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Stefania Milan. Thanks for your great presentation. We go right away to the next panelist, Robin Schelicatis, with his presentation, Can Digital Disobedience Be Civil? Robin, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation, Chris and Nir. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And it's actually quite fitting that I come after Stefania. I hope you can see my screen now. Does that work? Both because, I know Stefania, I've known her for a long time. We were colleagues at the University of Amsterdam for many years before I left for Berlin, and I learned a lot from her about how the digital shapes protests. So I'll talk a bit about that. And it also follows nicely from her analysis of the broader context. So my question is, can digital disobedience be civil? And I asked that question because if you think of civil disobedience, people still have primarily non-digital associations. So, they think of the classical cases, Martin Luther King, the American Civil Rights Movement, Mahatma Gandhi, maybe of more recent forms of civil disobedience. The Indian farmers just managed to, after many months of protest, to pressure Modi into repealing the farm laws. Climate activists are obviously launching civil disobedience actions in many different countries in order to raise awareness and exert pressure on politicians to address climate change. And in this kind of offline variant, civil disobedience has become an almost universally recognized form of contestatory politics, which people generally acknowledge has played a very important role historically and continues to play an important role today in making the political and social order more democratic and more just in ways that just going through the formal channels of institutional politics doesn't seem to be very effective at. Now, the fact that such examples come to mind when people think about civil disobedience is in itself unproblematic, I think. But the thing is that usually they come up in also heavily idealized ways, and they have informed as paradigm cases how civil disobedience is theorized, how it's defined, and how it is taken to be justified. And again, that's not necessarily a problem, but I want to show in my presentation today that the way in which both mainstream theorizing about civil disobedience has developed and the way in which civil disobedience is often imagined in the broader public makes it very difficult to see that digital disobedience, that digital protest practices can also be counted for good reasons as forms of civil disobedience that should be seen as playing a very important role in addressing democratic deficits, in addressing injustices that also characterize the digital realm. So that's the aim of my brief presentation, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. This question seems especially pertinent in a moment when, on the one hand, and this has happened over the last 10 years, of course, as well, digital protest is sort of criminalized, presented as digital vigilantism or cybercrime or cyber terrorism by governments and also by powerful corporations on the one hand, and on the other hand, the realm of the digital seems to have sort of shrunk in its emancipatory potential. The optimism of the early years of online protest is gone and gave way to the justified pessimism in the face of fake news, trolling, and sort of algorithmic shadow warfare, QAnon, incels, Cambridge Analytica, and so on, merging into this kind of dystopian digital threat to democracy. So I'll come to that problem towards the end as well. Now, I'll very briefly talk you through the 4 steps of the argument. I'll just briefly talk about civil disobedience and how we should and should not think about it. Then I'll talk a bit about digital disobedience and its many different varieties, and show in a 3rd step in how far digital disobedience can indeed be seen as civil, before addressing some challenges to seeing digital disobedience as an important variant of civil disobedience in sort of especially the contemporary context. So for simplicity, for making the argument simple, I mean, it's much more complex, obviously, if you look at the theoretical debate in more detail. But I think it's still correct to say that the standard liberal definition of civil disobedience that for a long time has shaped philosophical discussions, and that goes back to the influential work of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, also captures a kind of a common sense understanding of civil disobedience that you find in the public sphere, that journalists, politicians, lawyers, judges sort of adhere to. And this understanding is, on the face of it, quite plausible, but if you take a closer look, it turns out to be quite idealized and also quite restricted and restrictive, and indeed sort of not really applicable, I would argue, to the complexity and also to the radical character that civil disobedience as a practice has exemplified both historically and in the contemporary moment. So Rawls and Habermas basically subscribe to seeing civil disobedience as forms of action that citizens engage in publicly in nonviolent and morally justified and communicative ways. Okay, they do break the law, but they do so just in order to address certain local problems in the political system, not challenging the system and its claim to legitimacy as such. And they also, in order to express that acceptance of the legitimacy of the system, do so openly, and they accept the legal sanctions that come with breaking the law. So they don't try to evade punishment, but rather take it on. Now, in this kind of liberal view, civil disobedience is civil because of a variety of things that are taken to be essential to the very meaning of that term. So they're seen as part of the definition. It's public, so that means it's not clandestine. It's even announced in advance, as Rawls puts it. It's nonviolent. It has to be purely symbolic. So it's a purely symbolic form of claim making. It's communicative. It's a form of appeal to the majority. It's loyal to the existing order and to the rule of law. Because of that, ready to accept legal consequences. And it's paradigmatically an action that citizens engage in, appealing to their fellow citizens. Now, in the debate over the last 10 years, especially, it has emerged that all of these supposedly essential characteristics of civil disobedience are quite problematic. If you look at the practice, I just focus on 3 of them because they seem particularly relevant for the question whether digital disobedience can be civil. And these are the following ones. So especially if you think that the public character of civil disobedience entails that it is announced in advance and that it is not clandestine and not anonymous. Obviously, there are a lot of sort of even offline practices of disobedience that fail to meet that criterion. Usually, if you block an intersection or occupy a building, you don't announce that in advance, because if you would, the action will usually not take place because the police or whoever will make sure that this doesn't happen. So already for the normal kind of civil rights kind of activism, that criterion is in its strong interpretation doesn't seem to work. But it's especially in the case of a lot of digital activism that is anonymous, and especially by the group called Anonymous, which exemplified that point. The anonymity of the protest is part of its point. So it's not something that should be read as, well, we don't really stand by our claims, so that's why we don't appear in public, or we really want to evade the consequences, that's why we do that. But there are many reasons to remain anonymous, both offline and online, including countering the very problematic tendency to criminalize protest also in liberal democracies. But especially online, it's often just a structural feature of the digital infrastructures that protest uses. And in the case of Anonymous especially, it's also a kind of political ethos that is exemplifying and articulating the opposition to corporate and state attempts to control, track, trace, etc., all the things that Stefania has also mentioned. And if you look at facial recognition software and its proliferation, this takes on an additional political significance for offline forms of protest as well. Second example, it's often argued by especially defenders of the status quo that a lot of digital disobedience doesn't meet this requirement to accept the legal consequences. Michael Hayden, then NSA director, said, well, if Snowden would be serious that his actions constitute civil disobedience, he should go back to a bookstore in Moscow, get a copy of Thoreau, and accept that he should come back to the US and go to prison there, because that's what Thoreau did. Well, I think that's a very bad interpretation of Thoreau, but put that aside, it's just absurd to claim that somehow Snowden failed to pay a price that underlines the seriousness of his actions, given that he had to go into exile and fear for his life. I think it's pretty clear that he didn't just do that for the fun of it, or to just be provocateur. So accepting the legal consequences is cannot in itself be an essential component of civil disobedience. It's just a proxy to authenticate the intentions and the seriousness, but you can authenticate them in a whole variety of ways, including by taking the risk that is itself already comes with just engaging in certain forms of protest in most of the contexts, even in liberal democracies that we are familiar with today. And finally, the methodological nationalism, so the kind of idea that politics happens in the nation state and that citizens interact with citizens appealing to their own governments, that informs the classical notion of civil disobedience, is obviously inadequate to a lot of protest movements today. You can look at offline protest again, such as the climate change activism, for example, also migrant activism, refugee activism, which are inherently transnational, both in terms of the actors that are engaged in those, but also their practices and their aims. And again, this is something that is also clear in the case of digital protest, where we often have transnational agents and alliances of agents engaging in these forms of activism. Now, you could go through all the other elements of the classical definition. I won't do that here, but I think what these problems that I indicate already show is that taken together, there are good reasons to reconceptualize civil disobedience in a more, I would say, minimalist or open or practice-informed way. So I have a proposal of how to do that, and it will be relevant later, because I will argue that under this different, more political understanding of civil disobedience, it's easier to see why digital disobedience can indeed be civil, whereas on the traditional kind of standard liberal view, it's really quite difficult to see how digital disobedience could ever meet the standards of civility and the kind of idealizations that come with it that are a part of the liberal definition. Now, to give kind of the broad picture, I think that civil disobedience and its practice over the last, let's just say 20, 25 years have been characterized by four tendencies. And again, digital disobedience is of particular interest because these tendencies come together in that kind of specific practice of disobedience. So one tendency I think that is interesting is the move away from just thinking about civil disobedience in terms of defending individual rights to it being a kind of practice of democratization that addresses democratic deficits. A second feature I've already mentioned, or tendency, that's the transnationalization. So the fact that today we often have transnational actors engaging in transnational practices, addressing a transnational public in response to transnational challenges. The third tendency is digitalization. So civil disobedience today often takes digital forms and not just offline practices of digital disobedience of civil disobedience using digital tools to enhance their offline performance, but many of them are inherently or constitutively digital, and that's what I think also makes them interesting. And finally, there's a process of radicalization maybe that one could diagnose, where civil disobedience is less and less aiming at just local corrections to a system that people are sort of in general quite happy with, and more civil disobedience is directed at systemic change. That's true for the climate change movement, that's true for a lot of current anti-racist movements, and I think it's true for a lot of digital rights and digital democracy movements today as well. Now, to shift to digital disobedience and why, or to put it differently, why I think it's important to first get a sense of the complexity of that phenomenon. I just want to talk you through very briefly through a kind of overview of some of the historically influential forms of digital disobedience. It's a long tradition. Online activism started early on with the emergence of the internet, especially in the 90s as a kind of mass medium of communication. Of course, Anonymous for a long time dominated the debate and really triggered, let's say, more academic and theoretical engagements with digital protest practices in 2012 at the height of this fascination that Anonymous also gave rise to. Time magazine, in what must be seen as a kind of ironic twist, declared Anonymous one of the most influential people of that year. Well, I guess it's clear what they meant with that, but still, it's quite awkward how that group, which calls itself Anonymous, they try to fit it into this kind of old school personalized model of heroic individualism. But it's important to see that while Anonymous has definitely changed the nature of digital activism and led to its society-wide discussion, there has been a lot of different practices emerging since the beginning of digitalization. In a very brief history, you could distinguish in the early years, I think, especially two models. The Cell versus the Swarm. The Critical Art Ensemble published one of the first texts on electronic civil disobedience in '94. The Electronic Disturbance Theater a few years later countered that Cell model of the Critical Art Ensemble with a more participatory, mass-oriented model of civil disobedience. That's still a quite important distinction to make sense of contemporary protest practices, I think. In the art ensemble's view, the move to digital disobedience is necessary because of a change in the power relations. Basically, they say you can't storm the Winter Palace anymore, or you can do it, but you will not find power in there. Power has left the building and has disseminated into networks, infrastructures, logistics, and that's where protests have to go. Protest has to shift from the streets to those online networks, and it has to basically try to block the flow of information and of capital, etc., in ways that you will never achieve when you just block an intersection or storm a palace. And the model for electronic civil disobedience that the Critical Art Ensemble envisaged was basically the clandestine cell that would sort of effectively strike in a tactical manner in places where these infrastructures would be vulnerable. Now, the Electronic Disturbance Theater said that's interesting, but it doesn't pay enough attention to the fact that power still functions in ways in which those digital infrastructures are connected to offline structures. And also, we shouldn't just think of political protest, even online political protest, on this kind of vanguard, secretive cell model, but we need to involve kind of in a broader participatory vein, to put it simply, the masses in these new forms of civil disobedience actions online that are supposed to interact with forms of disobedience in the real world. The Electronic Disturbance Theater also developed a program that allowed people to do so, the FloodNet application, as it was called, which was basically an early tool allowing for what then came to be called DDoS attacks or actions. So basically a form of hacktivism, which allows a kind of digital sit-in where users just use that tool to basically address a website of the institution they want to negatively affect by overloading their computer networks and servers and making their websites unavailable. This was all done by the Electronic Disturbance Theater in order to sort of support the Zapatistas and, for example, attack the Mexican Stock Exchange in this way. Now, over time, these kind of early hacktivist practices that haven't really gained that much public or broader attention became part of a much broader phenomenon of digital activism that did gain more attention, and that, again, with, landed on the cover of Time magazine. You had, of course, the WikiLeaks phenomenon. You had, Edward Snowden's revelations. You had the so-called Twitter and Facebook revolutions, a name that many find very problematic because the role of Twitter and Facebook in these revolutions was to a certain extent important, but certainly the revolutions themselves still took place in the squares and streets. But in any case, it became clear that social media and the internet do not just provide tools to generate publicity, share information, to mobilize and to coordinate for movements that exist in the real world, as it were, but also we see new forms of digital activism and direct action online emerging that are constitutively digital, that take the digital as their own field of operation, that address digital power relations, as it were, and that do so in practices that are themselves necessarily digital. Now, the most common of these, I just very briefly run through them, and I'm aware I have to come to an end very quickly. The DDoS and kind of virtual sit-ins I mentioned before, the leaking that Snowden, of course, has become famous for, forms of political hacking, where groups like Red Hack in Turkey or the cyber partisans in Belarus, that's the most recent case, engage in hacking state institutions and leaking information in order to support offline protest movements. In the case of Turkey, the Gezi Park protests. In the case of Belarus, the oppositional movement that was confronted with harsh state repression on the street. You find forms of website defacement, forms of tactical media. I would argue that also the anti-copyright movement can be seen in as engaging in forms of digital disobedience, and indeed one of its main sources of inspiration, Aaron Swartz, who committed suicide and at a much too young age, as many of you will know, explicitly framed his actions in terms of civil disobedience. And encryption, obfuscation, in reaction also to facial recognition, as you can see here, are also forms that become relevant here. Now, obviously, the state and corporate interests are very much interested in denying the legitimacy of these forms of disobedience and try to portray them as purely criminal or even terrorist. And I would argue that that's a big mistake. While it's understandable that these institutions do that, the public shouldn't follow them. We should rather see digital disobedience as potentially civil. And in order to do that, we just have to give up some of these erroneous, I think, ways of restricting the definition that I talked about before. So in terms of the definition, it's, I think, clear that a lot of acts of digital disobedience are principled, politically motivated, and also civil in the sense of self-limiting in the terms of means they employ. They can be justified by pointing at the aims they pursue, namely protecting, expanding, or establishing partly recognized freedoms of communication, but partly also forms of democratic control and accountability that have not been part of how the digital realm has been set up. They are, in most cases at least, not motivated by private gain or criminal or destructive intentions, and their role can be potentially transformative and constructive of a more democratic and kind of political online space. And that's actually the main point I want to make, that digital disobedience is interesting in a whole variety of ways, but it's primarily interesting in a kind of meta role that it can play, in a kind of second order role, because very often it aims at making other forms of dissent and protest and disobedience possible in the offline realm by providing protection or information or exposing certain state attempts to repress those forms of disobedience. Now, just very briefly, I just mentioned these 4 challenges and then I'll stop. I hope we can discuss them in the Q&A. There's still a lot of skepticism. People think that protest is being taken over by the machines, and that the kind of talking about the aims and the intentions doesn't really make much sense anymore. Well, I think that's vastly overstated. I think a lot of the examples I've very briefly alluded to show that in many cases there are quite clear and articulated and publicly defended intentions and aims behind these forms of civil disobedience. And also in the offline world, it's often not so clear how intention can be established and how much normative weight we should assign to it. If you look at a movement like Occupy, people have all kinds of reasons to participate in it that shouldn't be such a huge issue. I already talked about anonymity. I think the fear of anonymity is well grounded in some respects. Of course, it can provide a cover for forms of harassment, intimidation, etc. But in many contexts, it can also be an essential shield enabling a protest under adverse circumstances, and it can be a political point. Third, there's of course the risk of appropriation. A lot of the tactics that have been developed in, let's say, emancipatory democratizing movements online have been captured and sort of weaponized by right-wing movements. We've seen that in the meme wars. We see that also offline in movements like the identitarian movement in Europe, which try to use the kind of aesthetics of disruption to undermine the very possibility of a kind of inclusive public sphere. But again, I think it's worth asking, well, are the means really the same, and how do different aims that these movements use also inform the means? And finally, there's a big challenge, of course, concerning the way in which the quite short-term mobilization online can be linked up in the kind of hybrid scenario that the electronic disturbance theater has already called for, with long-term movement capacity building in also offline contexts, where movements need to develop not just weak links, as Gert Loving put it, but also strong ties. Again, I think that doesn't detract from the very important role that digital disobedience can play as meta-disobedience, disobedience aiming at making disobedience possible, visible, effective. But that meta role already shows that you need the first order disobedience out there in the world as well. And I think many of the most interesting examples, from the Belarusian cyber partisans to the distributed denial of secrets group in the US, show how this can actually work. Sorry for going a bit over time, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Robin. We will have a bit less time for our discussion later, but it's no problem. We will jump right away to the panelist Will Davies and his talk on In Search of Proportionality, Nonsense, Meaning in the Digital Public Sphere, and we have about 15 minutes left for that.
Great, thank you very much for inviting me here to this event. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to actually be speaking, I haven't got any PowerPoint slides. I'm going to be speaking in quite general terms about some arguments that I've been making in some recent work, in particular a series of papers which I just thought, since if people are interested in this, I'll just put, is that going to go in the chat? Yes, there's some links to some of the recent papers that I've been working on in this respect, all of which in certain ways are concerned with the fate of the digital public sphere and the decline of certain liberal expectations for the public sphere, expectations that may have been in decline for some time, but which I argue have become untenable in certain ways in the context of platform capitalism. I've approached the topic in today's talk via this question of proportionality, which was not something that a sort of frame that I've used before. But I think that the question of proportionality is an interesting one in relation to a more commonly used term, which is rationality. We hear the term rationality used very frequently, the sense that politics has become irrational in the context of populism and demagoguery and this sort of thing. What interests me about the concept of rationality is its more literal sense of ratios and the expectations and the promises of liberalism that there will be proportionality, there will be functioning ratios at work in the way in which the public sphere functions. So, for instance, that there should be some sort of ratio or proportionality between the attention that is given to a topic and its political, moral, and aesthetic significance. This goes into some kind of crisis with the rise of the attention economy. That there is some sort of ratio or some sort of proportionality between misdeeds and the penalties that they are met with. Again, you see a sort of moral panic or a crisis surrounding this idea in the concerns about so-called cancel culture, whether or not we believe such a thing exists or not, that there is some sense that something has broken down there. Equally, that reward is in some sort of proportional relationship to contribution, and that artistic merit and praise are in some sort of proportionality. And then the sort of central proposition of liberal economics, that value and price are in some kind of sense of proportionality. Now, of course, these ideals are very inconsistently applied throughout the history of liberalism. There's all sorts of critics that we're probably all familiar with about why this promise of a kind of rational, proportional structure for the public sphere does not hold. But what I'm interested in is partly how the kind of very idea, the very principle or the heuristic of some of those notions of proportionality and ratio break down. And that's what some of these papers that I've shared have been interested in. Now, I want to start by just thinking about a couple of examples that perhaps many of us have come across before. The first is the way in which platformization messes with the notion of editorship and news, which is something that has just received a lot of debate since the spread of online news services over the last 20 years. Now, of course, prior to digitization, editors may have been corrupted by all sorts of interests and politics and tastes and preferences and so on. But the absence of what in cybernetics would be called the feedback mechanism of precisely what people were looking at when they read the newspaper, at least compelled editors to engage in some form of act of imagination, some act of abstraction towards some notion of what the public, however conceived and however exclusionary and prejudicial that concept might be in practice, but some act of abstraction and imagination towards what the public interest might consist of. That is what counts as worthwhile news, and that which deserves to go on the front page and that which deserves to go on the second page, and so on. Now, again, of course, in practice, critics of journalism and editorship and so on are as old as these newspapers themselves. But at the very least, the structure of these newspapers in an analog age allowed for the maintenance of some kind of liberal ideal of the public interest or the general interest as mediated via some kind of vocation of public interest journalism and so on. Now, we know today that, of course, all newspapers face this alternative basis for the justification of their choices and their decisions, which is clicks and eyeball time on particular news items and content and so on. And this changes the very possibilities and the very identity and the purpose of news in the public sphere, because it effectively means that for a newspaper to disregard this as a source of data, to disregard this feedback mechanism, involves some act of effectively some form of a type of cultural elitism to believe that certain things are of some kind of value over and above what this data source suggests. And this is a constant strain. Anyone who knows people who work in newspapers, particularly newspapers that self-identify as liberal, this is a constant kind of battle of what to do with this data stream that didn't used to exist and now exists and has to be somehow kind of either incorporated into editorial decisions or disregarded. So it messes with basic concepts of editorial rationality, editorial proportionality. The second example I wanted to use just at the outset was the study that some of you may have been aware of, which was published in 2017, which was based on sentiment analysis of Twitter content. And of course, sentiment analysis comes with all sorts of methodological limitations, and it's a form of, I'm sure there are all sorts of critiques that we can explore about that as a method. But it found the finding, and this made some headlines itself, was that the content that was most likely to go viral on Twitter was content that was heavy in what the authors called moral emotion. And of course, this is a term that was assessed in a rather kind of positivistic fashion through sentiment analysis techniques. But this referred very simply to language which has both a moral component and an emotional component. And the examples that were given in the paper were concepts such as hatred and punishment and revenge and these sorts of things. But as I want to go on to say, I think that if you think of the consummate example of a moral emotion, it would be anger. And anger is both obviously an emotion in the sense that it is a form of reaction that begins in that has a psychosomatic component to it, but it also involves a response to a perceived injustice, a perceived lack of balance, a lack of proportionality in the world, which provokes anger within us. And I'm going to say more about that in a moment. I want to step back, first of all, and just give some brief observations about the ideal of the liberal public sphere, which I've already alluded to. And a lot of my work draws on the sociology of conventions, the work of people like Luc Boltanski and de Rosière and these sorts of scholars. And one way to approach the ideal of the liberal public sphere is as a space of measurement, not necessarily measurement in a quantitative sense, but that the institutions upon which the ideas and the ideals of liberalism built are the institutions which promise some form of dispassionate judgment and some form of leveling up of costs and benefits, crimes and punishments, and so on. The mechanism, the instrument that so many sociologists have been interested in as absolutely foundational to liberal modernity, including Max Weber, but more recently people like Wendy Espeland and Bruce Carruthers, is that of the balance sheet, the accounting mechanism of double entry bookkeeping. And the ideal of, as Espeland and Carruthers explore, the ideal of the balance sheet conveys within it a moral norm of an instrument through which people can go away in a state of equilibrium with one another, an institution, an instrument that allows assets and liabilities to be put down different sides of a page such that there is a declaration of things being leveled up in some way. Now, in addition to these accounting mechanisms, the other institutions that sociologists, including the sociologists of convention, have been interested in, particularly that law and economics are both foundational balancing mechanisms through which the promise, a core promise of liberalism, a core promise of the liberal public sphere to achieve some kind of resolution of differences and the promise of a society founded on principles of equilibrium, that crimes are met with punishments, that costs are met with benefit or balanced out with benefits, that value is balanced out against price. And many Foucauldian scholars within the governmentality tradition have focused particularly on the institutions of statistics as being crucial to the construction of concepts of population as being central to how liberal government works, a kind of quasi-natural object that tends towards some kind of equilibrium, and that government operates through a kind of statistical rationality through which things follow their natural course towards a kind of a form of statistical equilibrium. And for many, as many of you will be familiar with the arguments that Jürgen Habermas makes about the liberal public sphere, is that the principle of equality in the marketplace, so the principle of a priori equality between traders in the early modern marketplace, the early bourgeois spaces of exchange, such as the coffee shops and the salons and so on, produces at least the a priori principle of equality of speakers within an egalitarian space of discourse, of what Habermas famously explores as the bourgeois public sphere. Now, all of this is a kind of a sort of fairy tale in a way, but it's a fairy tale with very important sort of regulatory and institutional dimensions to it, in terms of it becomes a kind of structuring set of heuristics. Of course, it falls apart, first of all, because of the various voices, the various people that are not admitted into this idea of the public sphere, the various colonized people, different types of bodies, different types of actors in society that have never been granted this formal equality as members of the public sphere. And Habermas was himself conscious of the importance of property ownership to the admission to this space of formal equality. So these are the kind of crucial occlusions of liberalism that feminist scholars, post-colonial scholars, Marxists have dedicated so much energies over the years to demonstrating these various occlusions and limitations of the public sphere. The second basis in which I think this falls apart in important ways is capitalism itself, which is not the same principle as the market. And Habermas himself, in the structural transformation of the public sphere, identifies the late 19th century as the phase in which the rise of organized capitalism, the rise of corporate capitalism, starts to disrupt the very premise of the liberal bourgeois public sphere. But crucially, and I think this is a sort of, in some sense, a kind of complements Habermas's pessimism in that respect, we can see that what distinguishes capitalism from mere market society is the extension of property rights to as yet unrealized future income streams. That's a form of, obviously in more recent times, in the form of intellectual property rights, but even in the kind of early foundations, the early institutions of 17th century capitalism, the concept of securities that can be traded on the market, pieces of paper that earn that contain within them the right to as yet unrealized future income streams, starts to fundamentally mess with the very possibility of markets being spaces of equilibrium, spaces of formal equality, in favor of the possibility of return starting to become disproportionate to investments of effort, and equally the exploitation becoming disproportionate to to whatever one might have done to have earned a certain level of exploitation. So this kind of breakdown of measure, and this is something that is going to bring me to the questions of platform capitalism. There's this kind of breakdown of proportionality, breakdown of measure that all sorts of scholars have been concerned with over the years. And this is where I think the question of anger, the question of moral emotion, as explored in things like that rather curious sentiment analysis study, become important. And the question of anger, the politics of anger, is something that has been crucial to various feminist scholars, such as probably most famously Audre Lorde and others, but also I think more recently in the work of people like Peter Sloterdijk in his question of rage and time, that anger performs a very important function politically, not only in motivating people and mobilizing people to seek particular goals and to mobilize people around particular agendas and so on, but that what anger performs a unique function politically in doing is in highlighting the injustice of what passes for justice, or the disequilibrium of what passes for an equilibrium, or the irrationality of what is presented as being a rational, proportionate set of institutions and mechanism. In that sense, anger captures what in economic jargon might be called the kind of moral externalities of political institutions, because it is an expression of the various harms that have not been adequately captured by, for instance, legal instruments, the various costs that have not been adequately captured by the market, the various injuries that people often experience in a somatic sense upon their bodies, but which have somehow been go unrecognized by the formal institutions of recognition and the formal pursuit of equilibrium within the liberal institutions of the public sphere. So anger actually has long been understood as being one of the most important emotions, the most important forms of psychosomatic response, because precisely it is able to represent and communicate the injustice of justice. It also, and this is something that Sartre's work on anger highlights in important ways, anger is an emotion that possesses people. Anger is an emotion that operates both via the mind and the body, and it represents a kind of exit from liberal subjectivity towards something that is both embodied and potentially collective, something that can be felt in a collective sense. And in that sense, it is a means of capturing that which overflows the formal mechanisms of equilibrium and communicates and upholds and represents the disequilibrium that is inevitably present in spite of various efforts to capture costs and benefits and justice via formal means. Now, what interests me about this is that the digital public sphere, in the form of platform mechanisms of social media and this sort of thing, offers the capacity to give voice to a lot of this anger. So specifically, what we see communicated so commonly within various digital public spheres, within the platform-based media, is the failure of the mainstream media to adequately capture that which deserves attention. Anyone who is a Twitter user will know that how much space is dedicated to highlighting that which has not otherwise been highlighted by the so-called mainstream media. Equally, the failure of the justice system to adequately recognize or compensate the deserving, the injustice of justice. And so many social movements operate specifically against the promises of the liberal state. The failure of capitalism to adequately match effort and reward in various ways, and the exclusions of national identities, national symbols, national monuments of aspects of history that have been eliminated by force of various sort of orthodox political narratives and histories and so on. But equally, of course, many of those are kind of references to left-wing movements of various kinds, critical movements of various kinds. But in different ways, these are also this has the same discursive structure as what are often seen as populist rhetorics surrounding arguments that elites have abandoned ordinary people, that they are focusing purely on their own interests, that elites are unable to adequately represent that which the people desire, or that which the people value, or that which the people deserve. There has been some kind of fundamental moral breakdown at the heart of the liberal state, and this is what populists on both the left and the right trade on this claim that at the heart of society there is not equilibrium, but actually a moral disequilibrium, a failure of that kind. Now, this is both emancipatory, but it is also quite dangerous at the same time. And of course, we're all celebrate when certain forms of rationality, certain forms of proportionality get torn down or attacked or rendered unviable. But then there are other forms of proportionality, other forms of rationality. For instance, one might say of an independent judiciary, where people might become more concerned. And of course, there is also the fear of this type of politics tipping into what, for want of a better word, might be considered to be conspiracy theory, when the very grounds of a kind of consensus-based reality start to become unviable. So the question which I think this leaves us with, and I'm going to stop in a few moments, is the question of what are the kind of new rationalities in the sense of the ratios or the forms of proportionality that are offered in place of the forms of rationality, the proportionality of liberal institutions of balancing and equilibrium. And understandably, I think we would all recognize that the digital public sphere, both at the kind of front end that we inhabit, but more so the back end that we are so rarely ever privy to, there has been an explosion of quantifications of various kinds, an explosion of numbers of one kind or another. But at the same time, there has been a much greater difficulty of identifying viable measures. If we think of measures as instruments for public consensus-oriented judgments, not all measures are quantities and quantifications, and not all quantifications are measures. So we see an explosion of quantification, but actually a kind of search for measure that is rarely resolved in various ways. Now, one manifestation of this is what Isabelle Bruno, Emmanuel Didier, and Tommaso Vitale called stat activism. They have this paper on stat activism. It's a neologism that if you Google stat activism, it'll take you straight to the paper. But this is about the role of statistics in social movements and the ways in which various concepts such as, we are the 99%, for instance, these sorts of numbers start to become the basis, not for how the proponents of double entry bookkeeping might have understood numbers as the basis for resolving differences and allowing people to go away in a state of equilibrium and balance. Instead, quantifications become the basis for mobilization and for the construction of new political differences rather than the resolution of political differences. Potentially numbers as used as within things like memes and various forms of content that move around online become the basis for generating new controversies, for generating new conflicts, rather than as so many scholars of quantification and convention in the past understood numbers as being things which are used to settle disputes and to resolve differences. So we see numbers being used to undermine the existing ratios and measures of capitalist societies. Numbers go viral in various ways. Of course, anyone who's familiar with the way platforms works is that the numbers which often go most viral are the ones which, as that study showed, trigger certain forms of moral emotion, certain forms of outrage, certain forms of anger regarding what particular forms of statistic represent. often, and I think, I mean, I haven't got any particular field work on this, but this is more of an observation of spending time online, is the power of particular forms of viral content, which put bring two particular numbers into some kind of adjacency with one another, some kind of proximity to one another. So numbers which say, you know, this policy, for instance, is costing this amount, that same amount could be spent on this, or this particular politician is currently someone's put in a comment. We better take on back into the discussion. But often the comparison between magnitudes performs the rhetorical work rather than any actual kind of effort to establish causality between them. Now, some people, and this is where Mike Savage's recent book, The Return of Inequality, suggests that Thomas Piketty's magnum opus, Capital in the 21st Century, part of the power of that book, as many people have both praised but also criticized, is precisely in the power of these kind of meme-like visual displays of how particular changes in top incomes have changed over time, and the capacity of some of these visualizations of inequality to capture, to perform a kind of affective function, to spread, to travel, and to generate a recognition of certain forms of injustice, but to do so in ways that is much more focused upon a kind of descriptive statistics, focused upon various correlations, rather than a kind of explanatory sociology of exactly what drives various headline indicators. This itself is arguably an example of what Mark Andreevich in his book Infoglass has talked about as being a kind of post-comprehension epistemology, an epistemology that is focused primarily on identifying correlations and seeing how numbers come into proximity with one another, statistics come into proximity with one another, rather than upon causation of how one statistic relates to another. Now, of course,
I need to ask you to wrap up.
Of course, sure. I'll just stop. But I guess my final point was that the kind of ultimately the foundational problem of platform capital, the foundational threat of platform capitalism to the promises of the rather decayed liberal public sphere is that the most powerful calculative tools, as we know, are not in the hands of public actors at all. In fact, and rarely are they even in the hands of scholars and experts in civil society, but that many of the most powerful tools for the detection of these correlations, for the detection of these new ways of trying to spot correlations and proximities between different forms of quantity, are in the hands of private corporate actors. And this generates many of the kind of forms of distrust and paranoia that are key features of such a public sphere, that the foundations upon which arguments and controversies play out are foundations that are themselves privately operated and run for profit, and therefore the very question of which of how different pieces of content are likely to travel and what are the rationalities driving certain things up towards our attention and certain things away from our attention. We all know, of course, that these that the instruments and the calculative devices that determine that are in private hands and are ultimately not transparent to the public eye. Surveillance capitalism, I saw someone mention Zuboff in the chat just there. And this ultimately is the kind of ultimate problem that I think that we're grappling with. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will Davis. Okay, we finished all our talks of our three panelists. Thank you very much. We open immediately the public debate. We have a bit less time for open QA, but I will start asking the first question, and the first question is directed to Robin. Robin, in your talk, you outlined obviously a positive portrait of new digital disobedience and showing that it provides, let's say, low entry points for participation, and that the new media technology can broaden the public sphere, enables activists. So it's rather than enabling, a positive account on digital disobedience. So my question is, However, on the other side, besides new media technology as a new repertoire that enables disobedient protest, what about the mechanisms of data extraction and data exploitation behind these technologies? Should activists also focus stronger on contesting the profit machinery behind? And maybe is it too positive and too enabling view of these new media technologies for disobedient protests, maybe also blocking such struggles? And is it maybe idealizing the new technologies? So I wonder what you think about that, and if you could address that briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's a very good and important question. I mean, I think the response has to be, let's say, multi-layered. So on the one hand, I think it's true that some, especially more, let's say, mainstream forms of activism, and especially some social movement activism, is too complacent about using certain tools for mobilization or dissemination of information that because they use Twitter, Facebook, etc., involve these forms of data exploitation, and also making these data then available to state agencies that have their own interests in tracking these protests and what people are up to. So that's definitely a problem, but I think there are also a lot of examples of protest practices and movements which are extremely aware of this and which precisely try to address it. I mean, from this can take a variety of forms. I mean, it can take the form of something that Stefania has worked on, namely the construction of alternative infrastructures that are not following the same logic. It can take the form of counter surveillance, so basically using the tools that corporations or states develop for commercial or repressive purposes and turning them against state or corporate actors, which some of the political hacking groups like the cyber partisans do, like what Red Hack has done in Turkey. And it can, take the form of something that is much broader as a phenomenon, but often not considered to be politically relevant because it's privatized, as it were, namely the anti-copyright movement and the reappropriation of privatized content, both in the academic but also in the entertainment industry, by actors who have a whole variety of motives for doing so. Of course, it's just convenient if you can download a book you would otherwise have to pay for, via a Russian website, and it's convenient to be able to access, movies, etc., online. But especially if you look at countries in the global south, or at universities who cannot pay these rates for subscriptions, etc. And I mean, that was one of the reasons why Sci-Hub, for example, has been basically developed as a self-help tool for academics who don't have that access. I think there are very good principled reasons for why that is a political form of disobedience in this realm as well, which directly counters the forms of data extraction and exploitation that you highlight. So yeah, I agree it's a problem. I think there is a lot of protest that is not sufficiently aware of it, but I think there's also a lot of interesting examples of how this can be countered. And, I mean, Stefania has mentioned some of the ways in which both artistic and grassroots political projects are also trying to find ways to counter, for example, facial recognition and its weaponization by, for example, state actors. Now, this is, this is still very much in development, but it will, I think, play a quite important increasing role in the future. I found it interesting that the CNN article, which I included in one of the slides, was published in the style section of CNN. But basically they talk about so many ways that artists, designers, and activists have come up to deface, to put it that way, the protester. And that's one of the fields that I think will be most interesting to see in terms of the future of protest, how activists develop ways of countering these technological advances.
Thank you very much, Robin. Everyone, please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. And the next one is my colleague Anna Milojevic.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Stefania Milan. And we have talked a lot about the different contexts and the way they influence how people interact with technology and AI. For example, we have outlined differences between what we call global South and more developed West. And we can talk more about how that is connected with infrastructures between those two. And we also talked about differences in, for example, policing between countries that have solid democracies and those countries with hybrid regimes or even or authoritarian governments. But I think we can also talk more about potential or limitations for engagement with AI and technology between people who are more privileged and those who are on the margins of society. I think we didn't talk about those that are on the margins of society. So I could, if I can, may I ask you to reflect on those people in terms of engagement with AI and technology, especially in the context of potential for activism or more broadly for civic participation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna, for the excellent question that actually allows me to talk about something which is very close to my heart, which is, how this unfolds in, excuse me, in areas, in countries, in societies which are not the West that we have in mind typically when we think about this. Now, I mentioned something about India, about the fact that, in fact, India is the forefront of the adoption and development of, for example, the biometric digital technology. And we shouldn't really make the mistake of thinking that because the global South is the global South and the West is richer, that this technological development only happens in the rich West. On the contrary, and here I would like to refer to the work of Virginia Eubanks, who talks about the poor, mostly the poor in the context of the United States, but nonetheless, we can talk about the poor in much broader terms as well. Her book concludes in a way, or at least that's my preferred takeaway, but a very sad one, concludes that if we want to understand the future of inclusive technology, we don't have to look at our society, so to speak. Well, we have to look at the poor, including poor countries, because that's where the safeguards, both in terms of legal safeguards, but also awareness of human rights, are at their lowest. And therefore, these areas are used as test beds for very intrusive technologies. This concerns the global South, but also concerns other pockets of poverty that exist, unfortunately, also in the rich West. I'll give you an example. In the city of Eindhoven in southern Netherlands, Endemol, which is, by the way, the producer of Big Brother, together with a number of companies and the local municipality, is developing a sort of Big Brother neighborhood where pretty much anything of your data, including, from the toilet, are going to be shared in exchange for free rent. Now, I might say, well, hey, I'm lucky enough that I don't need free rent. But of course, I appreciate it, so that I can choose between free rent and giving away my data and paying a very expensive rent and keeping, control of at least some of the data. But that's not always the case. So the dimension of privilege is here a very important one, and not everyone. And here I refer to the case of India as the privilege to say, no, I value my privacy above, for example, social welfare of subsidies like food subsidies or even free rent, whether it is in the West or in the global South. On top of that, we see that there's a lot of draconian developments in the global South in a variety of different countries. I just mentioned India, but we can look at South Africa, we can look at Brazil, just to look at, let alone, for example, China, just to look at the BRICS countries, right? So which are in a way almost like they can be seen as the leader in their respective macro regions. But there is another dimension of privilege and unprivilege, which is important to take into account here. which is the fact that indeed a lot of this awareness, but also a lot of these concerns are concerns that one can only have when and if you have food on the table to start with, if you have something to feed your children with. So that's the other dimension of privilege. I mean, I work on data activism at least that's how I spent the last 6 years of my life, which, to echo what Bill was talking about, the stat activism is a sort of form of stat activism, whereby people, take very seriously questions of surveillance, digital repression, but also the possibilities that big data offer, like, for example, open data, and use that for increasing transparency, and you name it. Now, all of this can be seen, unfortunately, as a privilege or a luxury activism, and to some extent it still is. Not only it is very white and very educated, but it's again and something that you can be concerned with if all your other needs are fulfilled. So yeah, that's something I want to put on the table, and your question, Anna, allows me to do so. Actually, to conclude, I would like to draw your attention to an initiative that also tries to map these forms of inequalities as they unfold in the margins. It's called Big Data from the South. And you can Google it, you should probably find it. It doesn't have its own URL because it's under a project of mine that actually expired, but the website is still there. It's a blog, and it is an editorial initiative. There's a number of things that came out of that, all of it open access, multilingual. And the attempt there is to try to understand everything that I'm talking about from cases, but also from perspectives, meaning from theory, which is not necessarily Western or not primarily Western. Because, by the way, besides looking at these parts of the world to find out maybe the future of invasive technology, we should also look at these parts of the world as sources of very exciting scholarship and very exciting movement practice that deal with all of this. And actually, we just published an open access special issue of a journal co-edited by myself together with a colleague, Emiliano Trade from Cardiff University, on Latin American approaches to datification and AI, precisely to make room to start a conversation about what we can learn in much more proactive and positive terms for example, Latin America as a non-Western way of seeing the world when it comes to AI. And I'll leave it at that. But thank you very much for your question.
Thank you very much for a very interesting answer, Stefania. Next one is Chris Sohn.
Hi, this is a question for Will. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to formulate this question very well, but I just thought it was really interesting, the notion that liberalism relied on certain proportionating technical mechanisms. And I want to focus on the technical part, because whether you're talking about the criminal law, or whether you're talking about double entry bookkeeping, or you're talking about the editorial oversight of content, all of these are, as it were, technical disciplines, but they were experts in those fields were allowed to do that proportioning work in some sense because ordinary non-technical citizens could have some kind of oversight or insight or check on the proportioners, right? So there's a way in which the criminal justice system has to be open to the inspection of ordinary citizens, right? There's a way in which, again, legacy media there were oversight mechanisms available that allowed non-experts to have that oversight. And I'm just wondering if there's this change that your talk made me think about, which is that the new proportionate mechanisms are now, as it were, held by experts. Once again, that's not different, but they're no longer capable of having any oversight from non-technical experts because, as you say, many of the platforms are simply privately owned. That is, the proportioning mechanisms, the expertise themselves has to be, as it were, proprietary information, not available to the ordinary citizen. So ordinary citizens are left with what they normally have with respect to expertise, but no way of connecting their normal their normal oversight capacities with that expertise. And their normal oversight capacities are, frankly, stories. Right. So if the technical tools are numerical tools about operating on big data, but our ordinary techniques are stories, right? There's a big disconnect. And maybe this is the story about the sort of destabilization of the liberal regime of the proportionality that you're talking about, is that disconnect between It's not about that their expertise, it's just that there's no ability to have any insight now into the expert mechanism, no way of having that oversight that the old liberal mechanisms of proportionality have. I mean, even, shareholder meetings are in a sense a way of having oversight, and having independent auditors as having oversight over double entry bookkeeping, or jury trials are having and so on and so forth. You see where I'm going? Maybe
I do, yeah. And I think you're making a very good point. I think that's in a sense that there are sort of two dimensions to this crisis. One is precisely what you just said, which is, of course, that there is the sort of shrouding in secrecy of what is effectively proprietorial calculative technologies, and of Facebook is at the heart of so many of these anxieties right now, in terms of the kind of whole question of its function, its democratic and public function. The thing which I think is also crucial to the sort of it's a feature of the kind of discrediting of those tools of proportionality and those experts, though, is that there is, on the one hand, there's this sort of loss of transparency that you referred to, but there is also at the same time this huge expansion of the space of transparency, such that, for instance, public officials or public journalists or public representatives are thrown into a cast against all sorts of different forms of social connectivity and different forms of different ratios, to use the term I was using earlier, of why did this person like this piece of content but not like that piece of content? What does that reveal about their kind of inner biases and prejudices and so on? So the capacity of the legitimacy of some of these public figures and these public institutions is also undermined by a different form of transparency in certain respects, by the extent to which people are rendered in certain respects more transparent, while the technologies of calculation are themselves rendered far less transparent. So I think there are sort of different things going on at once, but I appreciate your point, and I think it's a good way of putting it.
Thank you, Will. We have a few minutes left for the open QA. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Otherwise, now on the list is Julian or Juliane.
Yeah, hi, thanks. My question, or thank you for the talks, was very interesting to listen. My question is maybe directed to both Stefania, Milan and Robin. I had the feeling that when you talk about agency, you talk about how AI we're not aware of facial recognition, we're not aware of practices of AI. And so we kind of have to make them visible. And you, Robin, say that it's kind of like possible to support civil disobedience that is offline happening. And I wonder if that kind of still feels like you're posing artificial intelligence as outside of the normative, like of the structuring agency force, or like of not being part of the context that also influences on what we conceive of as protest and what we conceive of as agency. Or you say, Stefania, you said that it's always kind of like agency is a process and that has takes all those contexts into account. But when you think about those surveillance practices that are entangled with then also analytical tools of protest movements, so you have I think in the US, this tool that analyzes where protests are happening by analyzing so many different protest actions, and then also analyzing social media activity to then actually stop people from entering a bus because you see, or that AI thinks that they will go to this protest. So they actually manage to stop protests and then also stop, or like with that frame, what is protest as well, because all the data they use for protest is collected of actual happening protests. So we as the society also author or co-author those algorithms or the functioning of the AI. And I don't know, maybe you could say something more about that that influence of AI into the very context and possibility of action in the first place, and also that's maybe Stefania and then also Robin, how this will make civil disobedience impossible in some way, or like maybe not impossible, but have to create new forms of civil disobedience. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A question directed to both Stefania and Robin. Who wants to answer first?
I can start and try to be as brief as possible. Thank you very much, Julian, sorry if I mispronounce your name, for the very interesting question. And I'm sorry it came across as almost like if AI is outside of the structure. That's actually not what I mean. But what I mean is that we are often, and deliberately made so, unaware by the market, unaware of the existence of this very intrusive technology. As you say, it's there, it's a reality, it happens in real time. And it has very concrete implication for protest. Protest, by the way, might become a luxury again. Sorry for some reason I have this terminology in my internet, but like in the sense that if I am, for example, an undocumented migrant in the European Union or in the US, I might, in the past, I might have, be more willing to take the streets with a much larger movement, because then you kind of vanish, right, in the crowd. But of course, if you are part of some, if you can be singled out by technology, then technology that is, so intrusive and so real time in its consequences, you might think about that twice. So yes, what influence does AI have in the context of possibilities of action? Well, a very, very big one, and a very, and a very sad and wrong one, in the sense that it has really the ability of undermining, for example, also freedom of association, freedom of, if you think in terms of human rights, freedom of opinion, and freedom of expression as well. And if you look at the description that is included in the reclaimyourface.eu website, they actually pinpointed much better than I can do. But yeah, but that's why in a way, I'm very much like what you say, how would you define that we are the co-authors of AI? That's absolutely true. And I wish the social movements would be more aware of that. And unfortunately, I have to say that, for example, when, actually this was right before COVID, so things now probably have changed big time, but talking to some Extinction Rebellion activists, so practicing civil disobedience here in Amsterdam, I was a bit shocked to find out that there was actually not much awareness of the risk that it would expose people to, because of this technology. But I'll leave it at that. There's a lot of work to be done, and probably Robin can complement this.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question, and obviously a complicated one. I think there are several things that are important. One is, of course, AI is shouldn't be seen as outside of the realm of protest or even of the political, but rather it presents itself, let's say, in this kind of black box way, but it is political. And as you point out, the things that go into it and the ways in which it is programmed should be something that should be made, let's say, more transparent into the subject of political and social conversations, even if an illusion of transparency would also be problematic, because obviously, given its complexity, this idea that we could just have the right intentions or the right people program it and then the problem would be solved would be naive as well. So that's the first point. The second point is that although it's true that there are all these dystopian possibilities that are already reality, as also Stefania has pointed out with regard to the UK, which is in many ways at the forefront in Europe, at least, of developments that we'll see in other countries as well, probably. There's also growing awareness that this is a problem, and even as Stefania's pointed out, within the business, as it were. There were also these large protests at Google, etc. Not yet to great effect, but it's not as if somehow protest or movements are just the, let's say, passive victims to that. In the US, there are also a lot of examples how researchers and tech people try to make more democracy-friendly AI, or AI to counter the repressive effects of the state use of AI. For example, developing more capable blurring technologies for photos, because the old blurring technologies could be very easily circumvented by police use of AI, or in the case of facial recognition, they're both low tech, put the hair in your face, and more high tech attempts to think about what could be done that involve AI as well. So I think it's a very complex field, and it's pretty obvious. You're right that the cards seem to be stacked in favor of corporate and state interests, simply because of also the resources that are available there. But I think there are at least some small glimmers of hope as well, that that another politics of AI could be possible. And I think disobedience and protest, I mean, that was my main point. Even if they might prove to be not super powerful in countering these developments, at least what they can manage to do is to show what is politically at stake. So to politicize them, to bring these questions into the political debate, and to show that it's not an apolitical, just merely technological issue that we should leave to the experts, because anyway it's too complicated to understand, but that it's really important to politicize them and to show that they have massive effects for even everyday life. I mean, Stefania mentioned this thing in Eindhoven. If you buy insurance today in Germany, you get a similar deal. Yeah, you get a 10 euro reduction each month if you agree to wear a bracelet that tracks your movements, if you agree to upload your eating habits, if you agree to have a chip in your car that measures your driving and gamifies the experience, basically. I mean, yeah, so it's it's a good point. It's I'm not sure whether one should be optimistic or pessimistic about it, but at least I would point out that there are these struggles about the politicization as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Robin, and also Stefania. Are there any other questions? We have only a very few minutes left, so please raise your hands if you have a question. Okay, I see Steve Lauren is raising his hand.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you to everyone. My question goes to the possibility of oversight, I guess, relating to two of the speakers, and the issue of the proportionality or lack thereof in an AI, more and more AI dominated world. So even the experts themselves don't oftentimes understand how AI goes about making its decisions. So the good example of Go, AlphaGo, where even the best players in the world aren't able to comprehend the moves that this machine was able to make. And I suggest that as AI develops and becomes embedded in our decision-making routines, whether through the justice system or hiring or credit or what have you, that even having that access to information won't help because the experts won't be able to understand. So I wonder what what their reflections are about that. In terms of coming back to some sort of proportionality or some sort of liberal order. That's all.
I think that was a question directed to Will. Is that correct?
I'm not sure it was, because I mean, I didn't come here as the resident AI sort of speaker or expert by any means. But I think it raises a very important question. I mean, I think it probably isn't a very realistic political strategy, but I think that simply kind of I mean, obviously the horse has already bolted from the stable, but I think that some of these technologies would be better if they didn't. If they, there's a question about which technology should not be developed in the first place. But I think that the question was about the ones that already have, and I think that this is, I think the question is, I suppose, again, this is for people who actually study AI to comment on, but is what aspects of law might be suited for the constraints of these technologies. And I know there are debates about kind of the granting of legal personhood, which brings certain forms of moral accountability, or whether, by contrast, some concept of capitalist treating things as capital, for which the consequences must then be somehow kind of incorporated into the liabilities of the property owners, is an alternative. Again, I don't know if I can really comment on this, but I know that, I mean, there is obviously a very live debate going on about what are the affordances of existing market law for the attempts to constrain these sorts of technologies within some kind of notion of equilibrium, to go back to the kind of language I was using earlier. But of course, I mean, the question hits on a very important issue, which again relates to this issue of a kind of post-comprehension society, where it becomes possible to see that X correlates to Y, or that, you know, X move leads to victory in a game of Go, to go back to that sort of thing, but not to have any concept of why. How do we sustain notions of proportionality and notions of measurement and notions of justice if all we're able to do is to be able to, if we're lucky, to spot certain kind of correlations and patterns between things, but not to ever have a notion of causality or explanation, or the forms of moral accountability that go with that. I think we need a kind of AI lawyer to come in at this point.
Okay, thanks, Will. There are no other questions. I don't see anyone who's raising his hand or her hand. If that is the case, I think we can wrap it up. It is 2 p.m. in Boston. It is 8 p.m. in Amsterdam, Bergen, and Berlin, and I think 7 p.m. in London. And I think we had a great talk. We had a great discussion, and we learned a lot about the enabling and the restricting phases and sides of new technologies, and that we can be hopeful that civil disobedience will remind us about what is at stake and what are also the hopeful traits of emancipation for the future. Thank you very much to Stefania Milan, Robin Schelicatis, and Will Davies for participating in our Boston-Bergen Forum for Digital Futures. And that's it with our panel event. Thanks for the participation.